Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Half Moon Bay Planning Commission for October 10th, 2017. One quick note, we have on the agenda a list of Commissioner offsite participation. Chair Rick Hernandez. Commissioner Hernandez had a business conflict, isn't going to be able to join us. So we do have a quorum, but we will be moving forward without Commissioner Hernandez. So with that, I am Vice Chair Brian Holt, and we'll be chairing this meeting, and we can kick it off with the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Very good, and with that, roll call.
Commissioner DeMann.
Sorry, he asked for you.
Oh, yeah. Commissioner DeBon.
I'm here, maybe.
Commissioner Benjamin.
I am totally here.
Commissioner Evans.
Here.
Vice Chair Holt.
Present.
And as we know, Chair Hernandez is absent.
Okay. Moving forward, Planning Manager Report. Jill Akes.
We're moving this up to the beginning of the meeting tonight to make sure everyone hears these updates. First off, we're acutely aware that you don't have minutes in your packet. We will not get more than one batch behind, so you'll see some at your next session. Your forecast through the end of the year, October 24th, we are preparing, Charles Lester and I are getting ready for your October 24th session on land use. November 14th, we don't have anything slated firmly, but keep that on your calendar because we will take that meeting. November 28th, pencil in that we have a initial study mitigated negative declaration that we're gearing up for the Highway 1 South Main Street signalization project. And I'll mention a little more about December 12th in a second. 32 Jenna Lane has been going through a round of revisions, and it's getting ready for you. It may be ready by the end of the year. Parks Master Plan, just a brief update since last week. Tuesday, October 3rd, City Council had a work session, received an update about the plan, including recommendations from the consultant and staff. There was also a well-attended open house. And many items came up. The primary theme was about maintenance. Another key popular topic with your council is designating priority as a community park, a 10 to 15 acre site. They gave feedback about both the post and Podesta sites. And so we just wanted to give you a heads up on that to have in the back of your minds if you're working on the LUP. So the consultants are preparing the draft plan now, and we are targeting a joint study session for the Planning Commission with the Parks Commission to take a look at the first draft of that plan on December 12th. And from there, it would be going through revisions with the Parks Commission and onward to City Council for their confirmation, which at that time we will know if and how much environmental review is required for that, and then you'll see it again to cover that part of it. So just wanted you to know that you're in the loop and you're going to get more material on that. The Seymour emergency permit work is well underway. We're in week 2 of what's anticipated to be a 4-week project. If you've any input on that after the meeting, let me know, but we hear that it's going well. We believe it's going well. We reported out on the Ritz-Carlton Piers at the last session, and since then we have been receiving the materials that we've requested through the compliance order, and we hope to have a very concrete update for you on October 24th. Caution signs will be installed soon on the beach and on the bluff. And that is our report. Thanks.
Very good. Moving on, Planning Commission communications. Any communications to report? I will disclose, I did meet with the applicant for item 1C, a brief meeting communicating about the project. No information presented beyond what was in the staff report or anything here, just factual information, a factual meeting with the applicant, really about the proposal and what was out there. So, and that was at their request, and appreciated the opportunity to just sort of get some information there. So that's my one report there. So with, I'm sorry, am I not? We gotta remember to speak into the microphone here. So moving forward, next item, public comment. I don't have any cards for public comment. Are there any members of the public who are wishing to speak on items not on the agenda? Seeing none, we can close the public comment period and move forward to item 1A, Planning Commission bylaws.
So I will just briefly introduce this item. This is the third time that you have taken a look at some draft bylaws. Last time we met, you requested that our new city attorney take a good review of them and provide their input. That's what you have before you. Assistant City Attorney Heather Minner is able to answer any of your questions about these, and I think your memo highlights the areas where you requested changes, and then we also note some areas where Heather provided some additional input, and we leave it to you for a discussion.
With that, is there any discussion amongst the commission? Commissioner Benjamin.
Can you hear me? I'm not getting across. So I first of all, I want to say thank you. I think these bylaws have profited from the additional review and the opportunity to sort of digest and think about them. I had a few other suggestions, and I have shared them independently with our planning manager, but I wanted to briefly discuss them here so that they can be considered by the commission. I guess the overriding concept is that the goal of these bylaws, from my perspective, is for people who are interested in the function of the planning commission to understand what it is we do. And who are, first of all, that will be interesting to the public. Additionally, if there's a member of the public who might be interested, might consider joining the planning commission, or if there's someone that a city council member might think is a strong candidate for joining the planning commission, it might be helpful for them to have a more constructive, explicit description of what things planning commissioners do. And we do have some language here that really helps with that. This is I'm looking in Part B of Article 2, where we're talking about implementing the general plan and administering specific plans and zoning and subdivision ordinances. And then a little further on in that section, discussing environmental review pursuant to CEQA. And my suggestion is that while you and I are pretty familiar with what it means to administer specific plans and zoning and general plan activity, it might be more useful for the public to have a picture of that. From my perspective, that means that we're going to review applications for permits, conditional use permits, variances, and a few other documents like that. We're going to review and recommend amendments to the general plan and to specific plans, to our local coastal program and to our local coastal program implementation plan. We are the appeal body for decisions from the community development director if people want to question those decisions. We also, at least in the current version of the LCPIP, have responsibility with respect to initiating code enforcement, a prerogative to initiate code enforcement complaints. And my perspective is that a member of the public might not know about those things, so it might be helpful for them to understand what those are. Also, I appreciated the additional language about how to manage conflicts of interest. And it certainly makes sense for us to talk with the city attorney so that the city can manage some of its risks. It's also understandable that we have our own responsibilities separate from the city to manage those things. And there are various ways that we can do that, which would include consulting with the FPPC or with a private attorney. I also appreciated that there was a reference to our responsibility to disclose ex parte communications, and I appreciate that addition. I also think that if we have potentially overly ambitious aspiring planning commission members, it might be that they ought to understand the limits of their investigative authority. We want to be sure we don't create sub rosa investigations. So it might be that there's just a few more touches that would address those concepts. I don't think this document is far away, and I think it's a tremendous, it really does a great job of addressing the Planning Commission's ability to influence its agenda in a way that the early drafts maybe didn't do as much. So I really appreciate the changes and have those suggestions for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Other commission comments? Okay, so with that, I guess we have Commissioner Benjamin's comments. I would second his appreciation in terms of the improvements that have been made here. You've made some additional suggestions, and I know staff has an interest in wrapping this up and sort of moving this forward. This has been to the commission a number of times now. So I guess I would request, are there specific changes or amendments that you could make as part of a motion now, Commissioner Benjamin, that would be included in here that we could move this forward? Or are you suggesting that we postpone this for another review?
Oh no, I think it's quite possible to act on this, although I'd appreciate it. I don't know if staff has reservations or if the city attorney's office have reservations, but I'm happy to hear their thoughts about that. There was one additional thought, which was with respect to the ability, whether or not there is an ability to call up appeals, and whether that has any, bears any influence in the bylaws. So those are, I certainly don't want to obstruct the process. I want to see it move forward, but I thought these might be constructive changes that they could support.
Looks like our city attorney has comments.
Sure. Thank you, commissioners, for your review of these bylaws and looking at them again. So I appreciate the desire to have more detail about the roles of the Planning Commission in here. I will say that the functions listed in the bylaws are, the first 6 of them are word for word out of the government code, so that's just repeating state law requirements. And then the 7th one kind of incorporates the requirements that have been imposed on the Planning Commission by the City Council in the municipal code. And so when number 7 then says perform other functions directed by the City Council and consistent with the municipal code, and then gives some examples. And so right now, I believe that this 7th bullet here is sort of cross-referencing all the other functions of the Planning Commission that's contained in the municipal code. And it might be simpler to do it that way in case the municipal code is amended in the future, and that we wouldn't have to then go back and include all those provisions in the bylaws. But so I believe that the additional functions are captured that way, and that they can be discovered by looking at the specific municipal code provisions, and specifically the municipal code provision regarding the Planning Commission in Chapter 224 includes functions about performing the functions assigned to the Historic Preservation Commission, and serving as the hearing body for architectural review. And then there's other functions to the Planning Commission scattered throughout the municipal code. So, we could try to spell all those out, but I think that the cross-reference hopefully will be sufficient.
Regarding the ability to call up appeals, staff did do an initial review of the municipal code to see if there was that explicitly stated. We couldn't initially find it. I don't think, we can add that by these bylaws, and if it's not in the municipal code, this planning commission wouldn't have the authority to do it. And then regarding limits of investigatory authority to the planning commissioners, that is certainly something we want to impart on them. I believe the city clerk does a planning or a training session for new planning commissioners, and we could encourage her to emphasize that if she doesn't already. I just wanted to make sure that this advice about ex parte communications was in here. We could beef that up a little bit and say that investigations or ex parte investigations are discouraged, something like that in the beginning of that sentence. But I think it can also be dealt with in trainings, and I know that staff has a desire to finalize these right now.
Right. So your comments about them being, I don't quibble.
Maybe speak into the microphone a
I'm
little bit
sorry.
closer there.
So I agree with you that there's not something missing. There's a lot incorporated by reference in that language. My concern is that it's existential. It's not identified in a way that someone who doesn't know where to look would know what it means. So perhaps it would be sufficient to just make a reference to the specific sections of the document, and that way, as those sections of the document, community code, are amended, we can, there's a central place where someone can go. If that's easier to change than the bylaws, that's great. So, and as for sub-rosa investigations, we can certainly make a recommendation, I think, while the staff has a chance to formulate how they want to act on that. I think either approach is fine. I just didn't see a reference to it. Discussing it in training is fine. I think we could all use a refresher since the laws change from time to time. So with that, I would move that we approve the resolution next in order to recommend this to the City Council with the suggestion of incorporating references to the Muni Code sections that define the Planning Commission functions. That's it.
Okay, we have a motion. Do I hear a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, so motion is approved. Moving on to our next item, item 1B, 630 Priestman Street. Planning Manager Joe Akes, or Scott. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioners. This project is it's a relatively simple project. It involves a 290 square foot addition in the rear of the existing building, as well as construction of a small deck, ADA parking space and accessible lift, demolition and rebuilding, expansion of the existing detached garage, and demolition of the non-permitted dilapidated structures in the rear yard. As conditioned, the project also includes new curb, gutter, and sidewalk along the entire frontage of the subject property. And the permits requested include a coastal development permit, architectural review, historic preservation permit, and parking exception. A little bit on the permit history of the subject property. The main building was moved to the site in roughly 1912, and major exterior modifications took place in 1983. The property was converted from a residence to commercial use, a day spa, in 2001. And then more recently, in 2015, substantial renovation of the existing, now commercial building took place, which included renovation of the removal and renovation of the existing windows and exterior siding. As you can see, story poles have been installed in conformance with the city standards in preparation for tonight's meeting. The subject property itself is mid-block between Purisima Street and Correa Street, and or between, and then along Miramonte Street. The site contains a converted commercial building, single-car garage, and then the other random structures in the back. The property is zoned commercial downtown and is included in the city's historic resource inventory and is within the historic downtown visual resource area as identified in our code. The property is roughly mirrors the property to the south, and then another block to the south, our new library is under construction.
Scott, I apologize, just for our folks who are listening in on, can you just make sure you speak into the mic a little bit?
Certainly.
closer there?
Sorry about that. So a couple key points for the commission to consider. A historic resource evaluation was prepared, design compatibility, and then also the parking exception. And I'll go into detail on these 3 points. In regard to the historic resource evaluation, since the property is over 50 years old and is listed as contributing to a potential downtown historic district, a historic resource evaluation was prepared by a qualified architectural historian. And the primary reason was to document any historic significance that may be associated with the property, as well as identify any impacts in regard to the California Environmental Quality Act. The conclusions made, as noted in the historic report, were that the property is not eligible for listing on the state or national register of historic places, and that's primarily due to the fusion of architectural styles that have taken place over time. The historian recommended minor changes to the project itself, the addition, to provide subtle distinction between the current building as well as and the new addition. No impacts as far as CEQA is concerned were identified by the architectural historian. A little bit on the design. The upper slide shows the proposed elevation, and then the one on the bottom is the photograph showing the site as it exists right now. And just to hone in on the components of the project, this is where the addition would take place, as seen on the rear elevation. Here's the new deck and ADA lift, and the rebuilt detached garage. Now, in regard to the parking exception, with the existing commercial building as well as the addition, 4 off-street parking spaces would normally be required. In this case, there's only one that's accessible, and part of the project is to convert that one space to an ADA accessible parking space. So that leaves us 3 parking spaces shy, and thus hence the parking exception that's been requested. Staff can make the findings for the required parking exception, and part of making the findings includes allowing adaptive reuse of the existing building on the site, as opposed to, say, demolishing the building and starting over. Bicycle parking, as required by our code, has been noted on the site plan that's been provided in your staff report. And let's see, I do want to note there was a typo in Exhibit A of the resolution that indicated 9 spaces that were included in the requested in the parking exception. We've changed that language to indicate 3 spaces in tandem. So in conclusion, staff is supportive of the project, and we did actually this afternoon receive one email expressing support for the project, and we've provided you a copy this afternoon. We recommend that the Planning Commission provide the applicant an opportunity to present the project, take public comment, evaluate any thoughts that are brought up, and we've included a recommended motion. and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you. So before we move to public comment and planning commission questions, I know there was some question about planning commissioners' conflict. I don't know, Jill, in the interest of transparency, do you want to speak to that at all?
Yes, we've, Commissioner Evans is within 500 feet, but we've requested an opinion by the FPPC, who concluded that he could participate in this decision.
Very good. So with that, let's see, do we want to go to public comment first or to hear from the applicant?
A couple of questions maybe first.
Okay, questions of staff, yeah, absolutely. Commissioner Evans.
In the permit history, in 2001, when it was converted from a residence to commercial space, was there anything about parking at that time? Any kind of, any action or any, with that, if that's something that was done with a permit, was there something with that permit that had anything to do with parking?
Not that was indicated in the public record.
And then I had a comment about that's, I'd rather bring up now. It's in the historic report, which is just fabulous, and I really appreciate that this was done. And my only comment is just to make sure that as things get memorialized with documents like this, that there's not a slight misunderstanding. So on the property to the east, that's the old barn that's there. There's on this page 12, it talks about that the Borden namesake is the lumberyard across the street, but the lumberyard was not the barn. That was actually it always has been a horse barn, and in the page 18 it describes that a little bit more, that the barn was a horse barn. So and it's not a big point, but it is, I think, because it's starting to make more sense. The information we've had through time is, and it's been wonderful to see these maps that show different time periods with what buildings are on what sites. So it's probably that barn is older than 1905. That's the only way we had to, with Mary Vallejo, when we first researched that. But it's always where the bank is where the sheds were for the lumber yards, and there's still a couple people alive that talk about that and seeing that. And then the corner where the veterinary building was the horse corral, and on Main Street was a house that they called a boarding house for the Coast Guard when they used the barn for their horses. But the barn was always just a barn, and I'm the one that put the namesake up on that when we remodeled the building to identify it as Borden's property, which it was his property at that time. So that's not a criticism, but I just so we don't get, as we get historical documents to come forward, well, this happened at this time, this happened at this time. I just want to make sure that we have as much anecdotal information as we can. But it was great. Thank you.
Very good. Any other clarifying questions of staff?
Yes, just point of information. What does a non-tandem parking space mean, and what are the other types of parking spaces that other than a non-tandem?
So to put it in another way, parking where both spaces can pull out without moving another car, parking on side by side as opposed to front to rear.
Thank you.
Commissioner Benjamin?
Thanks. So, so a couple of questions. So first, I want to echo John's comments about the historic documents. I learn a lot from these things. This isn't my forte as a planning commissioner, so thank you for that part of the report as well. And as I understand it, the thing that is beneficial from a historic perspective about this, based on the recommendation of the architect, the historic the consultant, is that we are, originally the proposal was that the additions were kind of going to look like the historic stuff. And the consultant said, no, make it look really newer so it's clear where the historic stuff ends and the new stuff begins. Did I get that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so Are there conditions in the project that memorialize that, so that won't change in the future after we, if we issue a permit for this, so that this benefit is, committed going forward?
Now, the detailing is indicated on the plan set, so those will be stamped and signed and memorialized into city record, as long as it's approved as submitted.
Yeah, I get that part. I probably didn't phrase the question well. So suppose that they sell the place at some point and a new applicant wants to change that, but this was a basis for a significant improvement. Does the historic preservation section of our code protect this improvement? That's the question.
We did discuss the option of, adding a condition of approval, but in this case, that the fact that, the detailing is shown on the plans, and that's something that the Planning Commission would, approve, there is some protection there to maintain those elements.
I think Jill may have additions.
I think you're comfortable with the current project and how the plans would be reviewed and implemented. In this case, what I hear you asking about is a future project that we have no idea what it might be
Correct.
right now. Okay. In such a case, we would need to evaluate it once again because it is a listed property on our inventory, and we would then discover our historic reference document, and we would need to evaluate any addition pursuant to the Secretary of Interior standards as this one was.
I see. Okay,
Yes.
great. So the other question was with respect to the parking exception. In previous documents, since I have rejoined the Planning Commission this year, we typically received a statement of some kind that explained what it was about the property use that warranted the parking exception, what were the circumstances specific to the parcel that made that relevant. I remember when we heard the 719 Main Street project, for example, we were getting, a lot consolidation. There were some other benefits that made a parking exception seem advisable. And I want to be clear, I'm not prejudging that that's a good idea or a bad idea here. I just want to understand what the argument is for what is unique about this parcel that makes a parking exception advisable. What's the argument that was presented? How do we make the findings?
The primary justification for making the findings is the fact that we have a building that's listed on our historic inventory, and granting the parking exception will contribute to the historic significance by allowing flexibility. So.
Okay, so it's we're improving the site through not requiring parking, kind of the way we did at 712 Main Street is what I think I'm hearing.
Yes, and just for example, if they decided to move forward with a new project in which they provided all the parking that's required for a similar size development, they would essentially have to demolish the existing building on the site.
So you may have anticipated my next question, which is that there are a lot of different uses permitted as a matter of right in the CD area. It's not just commercial, it's also retail, which, as we know, demands a lot more parking. And if the building were going to change in a way that required a coastal development permit, and it was just a use change, the impact of this deficit might be much more felt than it is under the current use. Do we have conditions, or do you recommend that we add conditions that require the parking exception to be eliminated in the event of a retail use or some similar language? What's your take on that?
Well, hypothetically, if a future owner decided to establish, say, a restaurant on the site, intensifying the use, then a parking exception would be required at that point as well. So
The parking exception would be required as part of what permit? There wouldn't be a permit associated unless they changed the physical layout of the building.
that's right. Yeah.
So my thinking is perhaps we attach a constraint that says if the use changes to a higher intensity in terms of the traffic it generates, that the parking exception is no longer permitted, that they have to approach that anew. Something to think about. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. For the record, we had I stopped by City Hall on Monday and talked about some of these things, but we didn't develop firm answers. So I apologize if it feels like I'm putting you at all on the spot here. None of this, I think, is a surprise. But I'm interested in both, and hopefully as the conversation goes, we'll get clarity on how we want to go. And it sounds, Jill may have more to say about this. I don't know, no? So those are my questions. I hope they don't seem out of turn.
So with that, are there any other commissioner questions, clarifying nature? That, so we can move forward to hear from the applicant and hear what they have to say. Welcome.
Please press the button.
General contractor for the project, and Scott kind of gave you the layout better than I could. So if there's any questions, let me know.
Are there any other questions of the applicant or the designer? Okay. So with that, thank you very much. Thanks for being here. And if any other questions come up, we may ask for you to respond to those. So with that, we can move into the public comment period, and we can open up the public hearing. Are there any members of the public who wish to speak on this item? I don't have any cards. If there's anybody in the public who wishes to speak, please speak now or forever hold your peace. Seeing none, we will close the public hearing and we will move it back to commissioner discussion. So with that, back to commissioner comments. Commissioner Benjamin.
Oh, I'm sorry, no.
Or Commissioner Evans.
Appreciate the project you've done here. Just for clarity, because I am your neighbor across the street, I intentionally did not talk to you about what you're doing here, just so there would be no kind of misunderstanding. To say that you've done a good job of your building is an injustice to you. The facelift and the repair of that building is spectacular. It's way beyond what most people would do with those properties, and it's just fantastic. I don't have enough good things to say about it. Specifically, the restoration of the windows is very expensive, and you did a fabulous job of that. The originality of the siding. I'm envious in my own little bungalow house. I was looking for that Dutch lap siding, Dutch lap pattern on the roof. You couldn't find it, and somehow you managed to find that. And it really is suitable there. As I understand, and so I'm very supportive of the project. I have a few questions, but I just can't emphasize that the city is lucky that you have done this. And my understanding of the permitting is that the building itself is not of any particular significance historically, other than it's old. And the site itself is not particularly significant as a site. For example, it's not the first drinking fountain for Vasquez or something like that. And the building had been moved to the site, and the building with the site is only significant because it's in a historic district. And so that we're being asked to give a historic permit. Yeah,
yes, that's correct.
It's a historic permit. And even though in identifying buildings that say, well, this was an example of something that happened at a precise point in time, your building represents a style of carpentry that was done on the coast side that's just fabulous. And so that in its character is great. And I'm disappointed that when you're only just adding a small amount of space to this building and fiddling with the garage a little bit, that it's so complex and expensive for you to go through this process. And I'm hoping that, I don't want to use your project as an example. I think that we as a planning commission in the city need to work a lot harder at how do we maintain our historic district without requiring all this extra work just to, make the buildings a little more usable. So that, and I'm really curious on the decisions you made to, wanted to hear a little more about why you decided to make the 2-car garage and the need for that. And I don't know if you want to answer that at some point. When I look at the face of the project, it's being evolved into a 3-bedroom house with 2-car garage, and you're continuing to use it as a business the way you have been. There are some inaccuracies. Brian, I'm not sure you did the drafting on this, but so there's some, what's actually there and what's on the drawings are not exactly representational. And specifically the decision to bump out the little room in the back. So there's already a bump out for the bathroom that had been done there on the north side. Yeah, and so and I'm just, I guess I'm curious as to the decision you made of the size of that bedroom.
I'm sorry, if you could please go to the podium and speak into the microphone.
Yeah. Is it okay to have this dialogue like this with?
Would you
maybe we can have a discussion and then.
like to? So yeah, we should go through the commissioner comments, and then we can give you an opportunity to sort of respond to everything at the end.
And I don't want this to be interpreted as I'm complaining about your project. I'm just trying to make it as easy. And a question I have for you folks is. So we're kind of combining here I don't know if we want to separate in our discussion the use permit for parking or this design review. I don't know if we want to kind of clutter that all together. It's a pretty simple project. So I guess my question is, like adding that lower wainscoting, is that something that is being imposed on you or is it something you'd like to do? I don't think it makes a difference either way. I think it's unfortunate that we're making reference to a state ordinance that I think is intended to allow flexibility when you're remodeling older buildings, that you can have some choice of different styles and different looks and not have to be overregulated about how it has to look. And so I think this is maybe a misinterpretation of that, where someone's saying to you, well, we think wainscoting looks good, you should add it. And I'm not convinced that that's important unless it's something you want to do. So, and when you'll have a chance to answer this. Yeah.
Okay.
And great. Well, then I do have for our commission, and I'll bring it up now, I'd like to make an adjustment to the condition of the permit about the curb and gutter and sidewalk. It's an important requirement. We all do that as property owners. We have to pay for that. I'd like to have a mechanism that we can make that condition of approval, but have it so that that it's not built until we've come a little further along with our street improvement and downtown specific plan for that area. The entire block has no curb and gutter. And the next block down on Prisma Street has no curb and gutter, and as well as Miramati Street going west has no curb and gutter. And so it seems to me unfortunate if we impose our current city standards, which is very limiting for, and we'd put that in the middle of the block before we know, because right now we're talking in our general plan and all these updates about how are we going to work with the streetscapes, specifically better pedestrian access and maybe parking a different way and all of that. And right now our city standards don't reflect cities other than kind of San Jose in that look. And so I'm not sure how, as a planning commission, that we can, but I'm suggesting we really seriously consider altering that finding, the condition of approval, that it's a requirement to do the curb and gutter, but it doesn't get built until we've, and there's other detail complications with that, but I would, for me, that's a really important issue on this particular project.
Vice Chair, if I can make a recommendation or a suggestion, that we could modify the condition of approval requiring the installation of the curb gutter and sidewalk, and instead require the recording of a deferred street agreement. And what that would do is allow the city, at the appropriate time, to require the owner of record to pay for the street improvements when the entire street is improved.
Through the chair.
Yes, Commissioner
Yeah,
Benjamin.
just piggybacking on John's question and Scott's answer, that sounds like an interesting idea. So one of the other things we're trying to do is maintain our, we using the term urban forest, what's the right answer? Is that part of the, is the planting of trees in this area part of that deferred maintenance agreement, or do we move forward with that? How do you want to do that part?
Yes, if I could answer that, it would include the whole streetscape, the trees, the curb gutter, and sidewalk.
I see. Okay. Sorry for butting in, John. Carry on.
No problem. Then a couple of other just sort of technical questions on the little garage that you're adding there. One side has overhangs and one side doesn't. Kind of wonder what that's about. It seems, and then also because that building is closer than 5 feet to the property line, it needs to be either 2-hour construction or have a parapet wall. So that's some other kind of design questions that would come up. At some point, you'll have to deal with that. And so, because there's no fire sprinklers, I don't know how you do the roof you have as a 2-hour assembly. I'm sure there's a way, but I'm not sure what it is. So and that's for now. I'm sorry. And when we get the chance, maybe we can talk back and forth about that.
All right, very good.
But thank you. I just, again, I can't compliment you enough on the quality of what you've done to that building so far. It's just wonderful. Thank you.
Very good. Commissioner Evans, thank you very much. Other additional?
Yeah,
Commissioner Benjamin.
just kind of taking this project as I saw it. We all go by there at least every once in a while, given its location central to town. And looking at the project, it doesn't seem to impact the front of the property. So, the fact that it's something that's not going to be visible certainly, in my mind, maintained the historical context of this project. So, assuming it meets technical requirements, Half Moon Bay and property lines, I've no problem with this at all. The issue that, and of course I raised a parking question earlier, and so did Jimmy. This property is kind of right across the street from La Piazza. It's down the street from the library where there's lots of parking. I mean, this is a part of town that is, in effect, designed for commercial parking, retail parking. I mean, people who go to Main Street, if they can't park on Main Street, they'll park there. So I think the kind of the retail parking issue is kind of part of the whole downtown issue as far as parking is concerned. And just to single out this property, to me, is not fair necessarily. I think if the property needs to come back to the Planning Commission because of changes that, in effect, in our mind means, yeah, this is a whole new ball of wax, I think we'll have an opportunity to kind of bite at the apple. But no, if the city code allows this property to put in a pizza oven and sell pizzas, and that doesn't have to come to us, I don't want to burden any new owner with that kind of issue. Mainly because I think it's in a part of town that has ample parking for both retail and commercial. So, I mean, that's kind of my comment to Jimmy's, should we do more than what's in there? So all in all, I think the proposal is a good one. It's a good project, and I feel comfortable with approving it with the changes that you just suggested as far as sidewalks, landscaping, and so on. So that's my view of the project.
And, Mr. Chair, or Vice Chair, if I could provide some clarification.
Please.
We took a closer look at the code, and in the case if say a restaurant does, if a new owner decides to establish a restaurant at the site, there would be a parking exception required, and that would be the permit that would need to come back to the Planning Commission. If in the future a visitor serving commercial use is contemplated on the site, then no parking exception would be required. So that's the one exception to that requirement.
Very good. Thank you, Scott. Commissioner Benjamin?
Thank you. So what would be a visitor serving commercial use? I'm trying to think. That's hard for me.
Our code does have a list of visitor serving commercial uses. For example, art galleries, certain retail establishments, sporting goods,
Okay,
corner
t-shirt
grocery
shops.
store, t-shirt shop, surf shop, sports stores.
So it's visitor serving commercial. It sounds a lot like retail. What's the difference? Just so I understand where the line is drawn.
Bed and breakfast would fall into that category.
Okay. So I agree with my fellow commissioners. I mean, the project appeals to me. This is in our downtown area. We're trying to densify in the downtown area. It's not like there are setbacks other than the fire safety issues that John rightfully raises. If they're not clarified, it would be great to get them. And I don't know if the dialogue is, if our approval is contingent on how that resolution should work. The parking exception argument that you're making about the sort of the whole area is retail and it's a bigger problem, I get it. I would hate to see the project be, I'm not a big fan of the parking ordinance as it stands right now. I don't think that's a secret. And I don't want to punish a better use of the land inside the parcel to facilitate what I think is not in our long-term interests. I think we should be creating a more pedestrian and bicycle-friendly approach. But it is the ordinance that we have of record, and I'm not a fan of nullification just because we don't like it. And we went through this a little bit with 719 Main Street. And as I recall, what we came out of it with was, we got this sort of historic improvement, but we also got an electric vehicle parking space, right? In this case, we know that the Coastal Act encourages visitor serving. This is commercial. It may be that the applicant would be amenable to maybe a NEMA 1450 spot, maybe that spot in the first of the two tandem spots, the one that's not easy to get to. Maybe an employee or an owner on that spot might be open to an electric vehicle installation there, so that we're dealing with our greenhouse gas issue. From a visitor serving perspective, having one on the front of Parissima seems like that was what we ended up with on the 719 Main Street. Those were the ideas we discussed. And they don't reduce the intensity of the parking exactly, but they do benefit our ability to serve people who come to town by facilitating parking space for a class of vehicles that are underserved in our city. So I'd be interested in whether the applicant, unless staff objects, I'd be interested in whether the applicant would be open to those changes.
Can I make a comment? I'd be really disappointed if we even asked them the question. This is a 300 square foot addition. The project on Main Street was 6,000 or 7,000 square feet of a whole new building. And to, if they want to come forward and put in an electric parking place on their own, good, but I think it's out of line for us as a planning commission to ask that.
I appreciate the concern, and the idea here is if they're bringing in a new electrical service, it's a really small thing to do. up front. To put
They're
that
not
in.
proposing any kind of service upgrade, anything like that's
Yeah,
not being proposed for
It
this.
may
so.
be that it's already in their facility. I'm not trying to be argumentative about this. I just want to get my thought out. The idea here is that the nexus is that they're asking for a parking exception. So I'm looking for a parking-related improvement that addresses that, which is something that we did on a prior project. So I certainly understand. I'm not interested in creating massive new costs. There certainly are some things going on the project. There's the demolition of some unpermitted, some illegal structures that had existed previously. And so I hope that this is something that we can find a medium on. And I'm sorry if that, I hope that's not overly disappointing. So I understand your concern.
Okay, so with that, are any additional comments, Commissioner Benjamin? Any additional comments from the commission? Okay, staff comments, please, Jill.
We wanted to briefly answer Commissioner Evans' questions, and I'm looking at the applicant just in case I get this wrong so you can clarify it. Staff did not direct the applicant with regards to the garage provision. That is their desired form for this, this addition onto the property. The wainscoting was something that the architectural historian suggested. It was not a requirement. So I just want to be clear about that. There is a parking improvement that we do want to note, and it didn't really get, it was sort of hinted at because of the lift for accessibility on the side of the structure. There will be an accessible parking space, and there is not one now. So just, we wanted to make a note of that.
Very good, thank you. So with that, I see our Public Works Director, is that correct now? John Dowdy, come to the microphone, please.
Thank you. I was watching over in the other office, and I just wanted to speak to the issue of the deferred street improvement agreement. We struggle with this, and in fact, we've gone through extensive research. We have more than 300 of these agreements throughout the city, probably equating to somewhere between $5 and $6 million of deferred improvements. And basically, those agreements, for the most part, sort of waive an individual's right to argue against the formation of an assessment district. But it makes it extremely difficult to actually call the money at a later point and deal with it. And you can understand how difficult that will be 3, 4, 10 years down the road, asking for that cash from a property owner. And so I don't know that there's a good answer. I don't like to see sidewalks. I don't think anybody likes to see sidewalks where there is no existing sidewalk connection to anything. What I would advocate and suggest is that you leave the language with regard to any deferred completion street improvement and sidewalk improvement agreement a little vague, because I think our legal staff needs to actually deal with that and to address the agreement in the form that we need to see that would make it far easier for us to obtain the funds when it's the appropriate time, if you're inclined to go with that. So I just needed to speak to the issue of the way of the past is problematic, and now we're sort of living with the deferral for the last 25 years of many, many improvements on the streets and the sidewalks, and we have ADA compliance concerns and issues, and deferred improvements that are not there. So thank you.
So is it not possible for the applicants to fund those improvements at the time to fulfill their permit conditions, but not necessarily build those improvements, and the city is able to sort of receive those funds and then decide what the appropriate time is to actually go through and build it?
That has in fact been done on a few rare occasions. We actually find that there was money paid. And then we also found that money was then given back to folks because we couldn't put it to use for whatever reason. But that being said, that's really what I'm suggesting is that the deferred agreement be left a little vague in terms of what it actually implies that we work it out, we'll work through that. But I think I was thinking in the same line of that, which is that instead of actually deferring all payment and all work and all efforts there, that there actually be a portion, or if not all of that money, paid at the time. But one of the challenges of that is that we, under statute, have a limited time to use that money collected, but I think we have adequate time, somewhere in the range of 10 years, to put that money to use. But we can confirm that, those legal issues with the attorney. So I think it's okay to go with a deferred agreement, but not in the context of how we've done it in the past. That's all I'm suggesting.
Very good, thank you very much. Any other questions or comments from staff? So with that, want to give the applicant an opportunity to step up if you would like to just respond to any of the questions that have been made. If you could just speak right into the microphone there, you almost have to swallow it.
Green, okay. We did have to remove the eave. That was a requirement because the building's so close to the property line. We originally started with 2 eaves, so it balanced, but that was something we didn't want to do. We do have a 2-hour fire assembly for the building, so we have that worked out. The wainscoting, as Jill told you, that was recommended from the architectural historian, so we went with that to meet her recommendations, and same as changing the windows in the back.
So I'm suggesting, just as a suggestion, you might want to just not have eaves at all on that garage building. Just might be a cleaner look. And
Okay, yeah.
I'm also suggesting that
Yeah.
unless you really want to, visually, the wainscoting doesn't, I don't think it makes a big difference one way or the other. And I'm not convinced that we need to make the addition on the building look different. I think that's an interesting, probably shouldn't use the word wacko, but it's just a, yeah.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, so
so I'm just saying, is it from the design review side?
Right, when we originally submitted it, the addition looked absolutely identical to the rest of the house. We took great pride in doing that.
Well, as I understand, and I don't mean to, just so we kind of get through this, it's just a recommendation from the consultant, and unless it somehow jeopardizes the negative declaration part of this, then I personally, I don't think that it's a requirement we should be imposing on you. Leave the choice up to you, and it looks great either way, and you guys, that's just my own take on that.
Anything else, or? Sorry.
Commissioner Benjamin?
Thank you. So I appreciate the answers to John's questions, but I wonder if I could get an answer to mine. I was wondering whether you would be amenable to installing an electric vehicle connection, a NEMA 1450, in your tandem parking space.
We need to go to the mic.
Sorry.
Apologize, this is on TV.
A personal car charger wouldn't be an issue. I think doing a public car charger would be an issue, just as the way the site is set up. It'd be very difficult to have it accessible for someone to pull a car in and charge it. So a personal car charger, yes, that wouldn't be a problem for...
See, okay, thank you. And the staff had a conversation, so staff was explaining the distinction of when we'd have discretion if the amount of traffic that the project brought forward changed because the use changed. If it were retail, it would come back to the Planning Commission. If it were to become commercial visitor serving, it would not come back to the Planning Commission. Would you be amenable to a condition that required a review and essentially eliminating the parking exception for that use? You could always reapply for it, but you'd have to justify it at that time. The goal being to align to the increased intensity of use at that time. That way they could move forward with their project now, and we'd have a chance to look at it again if the constellation of use changed.
So the way the building has always worked is any change, you have to go in and apply for a building permit. at that point, wouldn't you take those actions? It wouldn't have anything to do with what's happening now or in the near future. If she sells the building, or if somebody decides, or she decides to change the use of it, the first thing we'd have to do is go apply for a building permit. And then that puts us right back here. Is that correct?
Well,
Well, I see staff has comments and wants to weigh in, so Jill, please.
So we'll try to answer this question pretty clearly. I'd be very concerned about a condition that anticipates a speculative change in a use in the future when we don't know what the code is going to be in the future as well. And we do know that the code today would allow, well, would require that the city take a look at it. So I do think you have the hook that you need. The concern of this converting to a visitor serving commercial use and not being required to fulfill this need, I would suggest that we look at that when we work on our zoning update with the LCP update, because it's directly relevant to that, I think.
wouldn't this horse be out of the barn?
If the code changes, we would begin to review those kinds of use changes.
Yeah, so to be clear, I'm not, as I said earlier, I'm not a fan of the parking ordinance. I like a more pedestrian scale way of thinking about this. So to summarize the argument, especially if we follow John's suggestion, or what I think I heard as a suggestion was that he was open to the idea that they might make the item more similar to the historic structures. So we're no longer disambiguating the recent additions to the old additions as a more uniform look, which, as I understood it, was the sort of historical benefit that was identified in the project. I'm trying to figure out what the argument is. There's a list of these criteria on page 9, and if you could just lead me through how we get there. I'm not trying to burn a hole in this. I just want to understand how we get there from here.
My understanding is that the siding is different, the windows are different, the roof pitch is different, and the eaves would be different according to that recommendation. I actually think from discussion with Scott and having looked at the report that we have enough distinction with those things. I've seen additions approved with that kind of revision. I think the architectural historian is just trying to give options. I really, the wainscoting is a very distinct change.
Okay, so the exceptional or extraordinary circumstances or condition applying to the land, building, or use relative to other uses in the same district is what? I'm trying to get to how we make the finding rather than saying, hey, we found it. What are the facts supporting the finding? That's what I'm struggling for here. I'm not opposing it. I just want to understand it.
Didn't Scott kind of summarize it that because the combination of the building and the site are in the historical district of the town, and to make either access driveways bigger or substantially eliminating the addition to the building in the back, there is no practical way to put parking that without really dramatic, moving the building around, or tearing it down. So that's our finding, is that we're able to preserve the character of the site with the building on it, and
Yeah, I think
allowing that parking exception is that's our finding, and it's.
Okay, so
I would second that.
So I want to be sure I understand it. So it's that we're granting a right, that this parking exception is necessary, that's what it says here, for the preservation and enjoyment of substantial property rights for the owner. That's where you are on this.
I would suggest it's necessary to preserve the existing character of the building and the property.
Okay.
And the current
Great.
use. So with that, I think, is there a motion that we have here? Are there any additional questions?
No. I move that we approve the resolution next in order with the amendment that, let's see, John, I would like to get a friendly amendment from you on the architecture.
That the conditions of approval are optional that are recommended from the historian, and that we are addressing somehow the condition of approval of the timing of the street improvements.
Okay, so let me see if I can rephrase. So starting the motion again, approving the resolution next in order for the coastal development permit, architectural review, historic preservation permit, and parking exception, file number PDP 15054 for 630 Purisima, with the changes that the recommendations of the historic consultant should be at the discretion of the applicant, that a deferred street improvement maintenance agreement be developed with the city, that the applicant include, this is my addition, that the applicant include a private charging, the NEMA 1450 charging facility in the building. And
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? That they install it or they consider it?
they install it. This was the one he said he was okay with, not the public one. That is the motion.
Okay, so we have a motion. Is there a second? Not hearing a second.
Motion fails.
Motion fails. So,
Okay, so
Here,
why don't I try a motion?
let's
We'll
try
see
it.
whether we have a
Let's go.
second. Adopt resolution P-1705 approving PDP 1554 applicant for coastal development permit, architecture review, historical preservation permit, parking exception to allow for the construction of a 290 square foot addition to the rear of the commercial building, demolition of existing detached garage, 217 square foot expansion, reconstruction of the demolished garage on a 5,000 square foot site at 630 Purisima Street, based upon the findings and evidence contained in Exhibit A, draft resolution subject to the conditions approval Exhibit B, with the addition that an appropriate sidewalk and other improvements would be deferred, clause be added at the discretion of the Planning Commission, legal counsel.
okay, we have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Okay. Motion passes 3-1. Okay, so with that, moving forward to the next item, we have item 1.C, file number PDP 17031. I understand a commissioner may have maybe recusing himself, so with that, Commissioner Benjamin?
Thank you. I appreciate the chance to speak to this briefly. So I will be recusing myself from this item. The law requires me to explain to the public why I am recusing myself from this item. So I want to try to lay this out for you. I do not have a financial conflict under the Fair Political Practices Act on this item. However, as you know, this is a somewhat unique item in that it came before the Planning Commission some years ago and eventually went to the Coastal Commission and was approved with modifications by the Coastal Commission. I participated as a citizen in that project. I met with the applicant. I spoke with staff. I spoke at city meetings. And while I feel the project has a few changes, by and large, the project is quite similar to the one that was presented some time ago and was approved by the Coastal Commission. I believe that I could hear this project with its changes with a fair and open mind, hearing all of the evidence that's available. However, I want to avoid any potential perception that I might not be able to do that. This is not to suggest that the applicant would think anything like that. I would defer to them with respect to what they think. That's not my job. My job is to avoid the possible tainting of the applicant's due process rights by the perception that I might bring a closed-minded view to the Planning Commission's consideration of this project. And so for that reason and that reason alone, I want to assure them and you that I will abstain from this. I haven't discussed it with any of you. I don't discuss it with staff. If I have concerns, I certainly can take it up at the City Council. So thank you for letting me explain that rather complicated and unusual reason for recusing. And since this is the last item on the agenda, I'm going to go home and have dinner with my wife. So thank you very much. And
Thank you, Commissioner Benjamin. We appreciate your integrity and transparency on this and enjoy dinner. So with that, moving it over to staff for a presentation. Thank you.
While the staff is getting ready, okay. So I am acquainted with the owner of this property, and in the past have had conversations in my office about this project. There is nothing to do with my office being hired to do this project, and it's been quite a few years since we talked about it, but those communications do exist. I don't believe that's going to add anything to the impartiality of my involvement in this project.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Evans.
All right, good evening. The item before you tonight is going to be referred to as the Creekside Project or the Creekside Subdivision. It's an application for a tentative subdivision map, coastal development permit, and a use permit. The presentation will cover project background, project description, an overview of the analysis that is in your staff report. Staff would like to make a few clarifications. There is a memo that we provided for you, as well as in the back of the room for members of the public with some revisions. And then, of course, we'll cover our recommendation and the course of the public hearing. So this is an interesting case, as you just heard. This application is fresh to you as a planning commission. That said, it has quite a bit of highly relevant history, and it's recent history. So I'm going to spend a moment to just make note of a few of the milestones in that process. They were also in your staff report. There was a previous application made to the city in 2011. The application was for a slightly larger scope of project with respect to residential use, and we'll get into the project description in a minute, and I'll highlight those changes. It also included a commercial component and a couple other configuration changes from what you're seeing. The city reviewed the project. An initial study, mitigated negative declaration, was prepared. The Planning Commission saw the project in May 2012 and recommended approval to the City Council. The City Council saw the project in the following month and approved the project. It was then an appeal was made to the California Coastal Commission. In July 2012, the Coastal Commission took the matter up and determined that there was what they call substantial issue. What that means is they found that the appeal had merit, and they would take the appeal in a future hearing. They requested additional studies from the applicant, and the applicant prepared those studies and returned to the Coastal Commission. It was July 2014 with the full package of items that they requested. The project was approved in July 2014 by the Coastal Commission. And the Coastal Commission's review includes preconditions, and there were a number of preconditions that had to do with deed restrictions and some other property details that are fairly complicated and took some time. So when the applicant returned to the Coastal Commission with all their documentation noting the preconditions, he was able to do that in June 2016. And before he was able to seek an extension of the permit had a 2-year timeline on it. The permit expired then in July 2016. So the unusual and unfortunate situation is that this application has been reviewed by Planning Commission, City Council, and Coastal Commission, and because it wasn't extended, the Coastal Commission no longer has jurisdiction over it, and so it's back here. That's why we're looking at it fresh. I hope that made sense. I know it's complicated. What I suggest we do now is just move forward and look at the application as it is, and I will note a few things as we go that reference differences, and one of the reasons is that we are leveraging the very high-quality environmental review work that was done on behalf of the Coastal Commission review, in that it's still highly relevant and useful, and it's been updated for you in your consideration. So in brief, the project site at 320 Church Street is 5.5 acres. It has 2 parcels. The proposal is to subdivide to allow for 10 single-family homes and 2 triplexes. The previous application included those 2 lots would have each had 5 units, so this is a reduction in residential density. The project also includes a conservation open space easement, which is relevant to Pilarcitos Creek, which is on the north side of the project, as well as an easement for passive recreation, which would allow for basically a park, a small park for residents, and also has room for on-site drainage swale. The zoning is commercial downtown, like the last project you saw, and the local coastal land use plan, general plan designation is commercial general. Here's a little, here's our project site. You can see the 2 parcels. We are actually sitting in the EOC here right next to the project site. It's right there. And so to the north, we have Pilarcitos Creek. To the east, additional portion of the creek, as well as residential development on the other side of Church Street. To the south is a combination of uses, including property owned by the Our Lady of the Pillar Catholic Church, the city properties with the county, with the EOC, and of course Shoreline Station. And then to the west is Highway 1, and beyond that is a piece of Oak Avenue Park and some commercial development. Thank you. You received in your packet a full-size plan of the proposed tentative subdivision map. This is it here. You can note, Bridget, can you trace the private street? It would include a private street. The frontages for the single-family homes would be on the north side of that street, and for the 2 multifamily, the triplex lots would be in that kind of semicircle area on the south side of the street. There's a hammerhead at the end of this private drive that would allow for a emergency vehicle turnaround. And on the parcel A, that's the first parcel, the big blocky one on Highway 1, the front of that parcel is where the easement for the passive open space, which would be located near the hammerhead, and then the drainage swale, which would be towards the highway. There is, through the Coastal Commission process, this is where I'd like to make a note of a few of the changes. Diligence was done to very accurately map the edge of the riparian vegetation so that the 50-foot required riparian buffer could also be accurately mapped. The 50-foot buffer is a requirement of your local coastal program. And are you able to, no, it's the light green, yeah. There you go. The line behind that is another development from the Coastal Commission review. I believe that's the 100-year floodplain. The city's FEMA maps for the city do not come very far inland. Our floodplain mapping shows all of the coastal flooding, but for some reason we don't have accurate maps for all of our interior creeks and drainages. That's something that's actually come up in your discussion in the local coastal land use plan review. So part of the appeal and the direction from the Coastal Commission was to have additional flood studies. The 100-year flood was one of those studies. Tsunami was also considered. It did not affect the site. And also the very unlikely occurrence of a dam failure of the Pilarcitos Dam was also considered, as well as the combined effects. This is written about in your staff report. It's also written about in the initial study mitigated negative declaration. And we're happy to go into it more. I'm here with Dimitri Lucas from David Powers and Associates, and he can answer the questions when we get to the end here on any of the environmental content. So just want you to know that. All right, a couple more clarifications and changes from that project. The original proposal included a lot line adjustment in the package of entitlements that was needed. And we're, honest to gosh, I'm really not sure what that was needed for. It might have been to designate the commercial parcel in a different manner. And however, the documentation in the past reports is not clear. We're confident that a subdivision map is all we need here to take care of every lot line that needs to be created and everything else. So you'll see references to lot line adjustment in some of your materials, and we just want to make a note that in the recommended documentation with findings and conditions of approval, we consider that to be basically swallowed by the subdivision itself, so it doesn't need to be talked about separately. And then finally, a really significant change in the project proposed to you is that the applicant is bringing forward lot retirements. Lot retirements, the city does not have a policy for that at this time. The Coastal Commission does impose lot retirements on projects for the Mid-Coast and Half Moon Bay that involve subdivisions. My understanding is that the lot retirement justification is a 1-for-1 for every new lot created for residential development. The Coastal Commission has been requiring that one lot be retired, one legal lot be retired. The applicant has pulled together 10 parcels for lot retirements. This project right now has 2 lots, so it could support 2 different residential developments the way that it is, and the proposal will have a net new increase of 10 lots, and thus that's why there's 10. And he's already done a lot of this legwork, and he's included it into his application packet. You'll note that there's a recommended condition of approval about when the lot retirements would be in effect, which is before the first building permit would be received. The Coastal Commission's condition for this was that these would be in effect before the first certificate of occupancy is issued. 2 notes about that. One, we did make it a little bit stricter by moving it up to the building permit, and the reason why I do that is I, in practice, do not like the certificate of occupancy condition because the structure's already built. It's very, very hard to have a house built on a street and to say you can't occupy it. So I would much prefer that we tie it to the issuance of the final entitlement, which is basically the building permit. But on the other hand, the applicant has already secured the lots at this time. So the path to getting this done is much, much shorter than it was when the Coastal Commission put it forth. So I wanted to share that with you because it's a little bit different than anything you've seen before here. With respect to the analysis, this order follows your staff report. We're going to look at the policy, the zoning, the subdivision, and CEQA very, very briefly because you have quite a bit of detail in your report. If you have questions, I'm sure you'll toss them over to us. With regards to the local coastal land use plan, which is your land use element for our general plan, we looked at every major topic area, and coastal access and recreation is not affected. The environmentally sensitive habitat area was one of the primary topics of the Coastal Commission appeal, and all of the things that needed to be done to satisfy their permit have come forward in this application. With regards to hazards, we talked about the flooding mapping, and again, that was a key topic of the appeal, and the analysis and condition of approval for building above the floodplain, the finished floor of the structures above the floodplain for the combined effects of a 100-year storm event, as well as the unlikely event of a dam failure, is part of your conditions of approval. Visual resources was also another item the Coastal Commission really picked up on, and I think that what is resulting from that is going to be very very desirable. The setback from Highway 1 will maintain that sense of openness that everybody's used to and appreciates about that scenic corridor. The applicant has agreed to some rather delicate work to maintain the cypress trees. You know them along, they're between the property, the Shoreline Station property and the subject property here. We go to the farmer's market and we all see them. It's part of the backdrop. So there's every intent of maintaining those, and you'll note the arborist report is still part of the record. With respect to development, all of those requirements are met in terms of the provision of services, particularly water and sewer. And traffic analysis has been conducted and in fact updated. So policy-wise, we found staff is recommending a finding of consistency. With regards to zoning, the growth control Measure D certificates would be required at a future point by applicant for coastal development permits for the individual residential development. So that is a condition of approval. They do not need to be secured at this time. Just for a sense of scale, this year's 66 units are allowed through our system, and this project includes 16 units, so it's possible that it could even secure all of its permits in 1 year, or it could phase them over a longer period of time. A use permit is required in the commercial downtown zoning district for residential development. It's a conditionally permitted use. That district is a mixed-use district that is most permissive to commercial uses by right, but also allows mixed use and straight up residential on its own. We believe, the staff believes that mixed use, whether it be in a vertical format where you have residential over commercial, or even in this kind of what we would call horizontal mixed use, where it's single use on the site, can be very supportive of the vibrancy of your mixed use district. And in fact, with the residential use right across the street on Church, we think the context is appropriate for this. Development standards would need to be conformed with. that is something we can't check now. That would come later with the actual structures. The city has a below market rate housing ordinance as part of your zoning code. That is a condition of approval, and City Council has in very recent times indicated they want production as part of development of these sites, and so that is how that condition was crafted. A affordable housing agreement would need to be processed and approved by the City Council at the time that the final map is considered. Visual resource protection standards are conformed with, and we already talked about that from the policy side with the setback. And I also wanted to note we're adding a condition of approval about not fencing. We want to make sure that that park and that swale don't have tall fences. We want to keep that sense of openness because that is really consistent with what we read in our code for this. And then, of course, riparian corridors and buffer zones, we've already mentioned that. With regards to the subdivision ordinance, all of the findings are provided in your staff report in the Exhibit A of Attachment 1, and they're just listed. These are the topics of the findings, and I think we've already touched on most of them. And if you have questions about them, let me know. One that I would like to note to add, though, is that the city has a parkland standard for subdivisions, and so this project is subject to that, and that is something that is paid at the time of the final map approval. And here we are now at environmental review, having talked about some of these items. The ones we haven't mentioned, noise. There was a 2015 noise analysis conducted, and exterior noise for residential development is supposed to be no greater than 60 dB. If it's higher than that, there's some conditional allowances. This site was found to conform to that, so it's going to be with enough space from the highway, it's going to work. The other thing I wanted to make sure of was when the noise, when this was originally studied, there was potentially going to be a building, a commercial building, on the frontage of Highway 1. And I wanted to make sure that the noise assessment didn't assume that that building provided buffering. The noise assessment does not assume anything about that building. So this noise study is just for the project as you see it, and it conforms. I've mentioned that the traffic study was updated because the project was reduced in scope through the elimination of the commercial development and the reduction in units, and the background condition was really substantially similar. No new impacts were found. This project is still, like any other project, subject to the city's traffic impact fee, which is payable upon issuance of building permits, but no specific project-related traffic mitigation is required. And then cumulative impacts were considered. Of course, the Coastal Commission's approach to addressing cumulative impacts is with what we already talked about, lot retirements. So that's something that this applicant is doing above and beyond the city's standard. We're getting to the end here. We want to note we received only one letter on this, and we provided that. I think I forwarded it to you yesterday from Committee for Green Foothills. They had 3 comments, and we'd like to address them. One comment was just the importance of making sure that the new development does not bring in any invasive plants, because that can be really damaging to the buffer. The whole purpose of the riparian buffer is to allow for safe dispersal areas for sensitive species, particularly the red-legged frog and the San Francisco garter snake. So Committee for Green Foothills wanted to see this provided in the CCNRs, and lo and behold, when we looked at that, we realized that we had missed our condition for having CCNRs. So now that was very helpful. So we've added a condition to your memo showing that we will require that CCNRs be submitted to the city. They are usually reviewed by the Community Development Director, the City Engineer, Public Works Director, and of course the City Attorney. We don't enforce CCNRs later, but it is something that cities look at when they're being implemented. So through that, this particular comment from the Committee for Green Foothills would be addressed. They also had a comment about the lighting condition, and the condition of approval for lighting was actually the exact same condition that the Coastal Commission used. So I made a suggestion for revising their language, and that's in your memo. Instead of the as feasible language, we're actually going to request what we would normally do is photometrics for the cut sheets of the actual lighting fixtures to make sure that the light is cutting off. And we know that lighting is an important topic for the Planning Commission, so I wanted to highlight that. We also, this one is the most important one, and it's the first item on your memo. We revised a mitigation measure. This exclusion fencing mitigation measure is covering two different conditions of the site, and it got a little bit mixed up. While the site's under construction, we want exclusion fencing installed so that sensitive species will not leave the buffer area and go onto the construction site. But when the construction is done, different kind of fencing would be installed that would exclude the humans and the dogs and hopefully other critters, although you can never keep a cat out, but keep us out of the buffer, but allow for dispersal activities of the sensitive species, which can happen in high water conditions. For example, if there was a big storm event, that can flush those species up to the uplands, up to higher ground, and they need more room to move. And so that's the intention of that condition. And Dimitri provided a detailed underlined strike-through edit of the last paragraph of that mitigation measure, and you have that before you. Staff also notes we recommended a few other additional conditions or revisions. I've already mentioned the fencing and the gates and the CCNRs. I've also discussed with the applicant that in the event that with the East Side Parallel Trail that we're contemplating, a little bit more room is needed. They would have room for a 10-foot wide easement along Highway 1. However, that could not be part of the exclusion area, and we're very specific about that in the condition. We revised details on the sanitary sewer system and clarified that the expiration of the map and all these permits would be 2 years. However, the city's code allows an additional year in the event that off-site improvements exceed $125,000. And I don't know the value of them at this point. They include a portion of Church Street, and often during final map review, a number of other things come up. So that will be estimated through the final map review and the engineer's estimate. And we didn't want to have to come back or do anything beyond just acknowledging the correct expiration based on the level of improvement. This, Bridget, if you could point again, this is your subdivision map. On the left, that little green rectangle, the farthest left, the tall skinny one, that would be where the easement is. Obviously, none of this is to scale, just trying to be illustrative. And then on the right, the far right, is the area where we definitely don't want to have a gate. The applicant never proposed a gate, but we just want to make sure that we would allow access. And then back on the common parcel A, the right, either one, okay, that one, that would be the passive recreation open space, and that we don't want to have fenced. And to the left would be the on-site drainage swale, which is proposed to be landscaped attractively, but also effectively for the sake of accepting the site drainage as needed. So this is in in this part of town, and frankly in the whole county, to conform to our permit, sites need to really control their stormwater. And so there's a good amount of space here to do that with the swale, and the engineering staff will be assessing that. We've got a whole bunch of concurrent planning efforts underway that these plans are not approved, but we do have them in the back of our mind. And because I've received some questions about this, I just want to, I know this is long, but I want to get it in the record that we've looked at this. With respect to the local coastal land use plan, the Pillar-Cetos Creek Trail in the vicinity of this project is intended to be on the north side of the creek. So basically what we have draft language in the Coastal Access and Recreation chapter of that document. On the west side of Highway 1, the Pillar-Cetos Creek Trail is shown on the south side of the creek. On the east side of the highway, it is shown on the north side. So it would not be on this project site. So we just want to be clear there. And I've already talked about the East Side Coastal Trail, or that's the wrong name, the East Side Parallel Trail. I apologize. With regards to the Parks Master Plan, this type of park amenity, we don't see this as becoming dedicated to the city. We would see this as being the responsibility of the homeowners association. That's still very consistent with providing for the park's needs of our new residents. The site isn't big enough to accommodate something like the community park that you heard about tonight, that our consultants are recommending 10 to 15 acres. The whole site isn't even that large. And then with respect to the bicycle and pedestrian master plan, which is following the parks plan, I don't see any conflicts at all. So I just wanted to note that we're paying attention to the things that are coming forward. So this is I just want to note a little bit of the roadmap, the structure of the conditions of approval that you have. It's in Exhibit B to Attachment 1. Attachment 1 is your resolution. Exhibit A is findings. Exhibit B is the series of conditions of approval. And they are arranged somewhat by what kind of permit is required from beginning to end. And so we start with the Coastal Commission's requirements from their 2014 permit, because essentially their staff told us that they would support this application if the city approved it substantially the same as they had. And so we brought them forward insofar as they were still applicable. Some of them have already been implemented, so we note that, and we make some other notes in that section. Under B, we have conditions that apply to all permits, and that includes the mitigation measures. Then the final map, the grading permit, coastal development permits that will follow for development, building permits, and then the applicability of the permit as a whole, including its expiration. And you have our recommendation. We are supporting this project. And I do want to note the next steps before you begin your clarifying questions, et cetera, because I think it adds context. I'm going to assume that you follow the staff recommendation. If you don't, we'll rehash this. But if you move this forward tonight, the entire package would go to the City Council. We're taking your recommendation. You're not the approval body for this particular item because the way the city's code sets up map approvals, the City Council is the final city approving body for this. If the City Council's action is to approve the project and there's no appeal to the Coastal Commission, then the next step is the applicant will finish their work on the final map and improvement plans, and that will be reviewed by the city engineer and other staff members. We will also draft the affordable housing agreement, and both of kind of that whole package would go to the City Council. You wouldn't see it again at that point. Future coastal development permits would come to you, or if they're minor, they would be reviewed by the Community Development Director. And that is our detailed presentation. This is a pretty interesting project with quite a bit of history, and we want to make sure that you have the full record. We encourage your clarifying questions. The applicant is here to answer questions. He wasn't planning to make a presentation. He told me to just go for it, so that's what I did. But he will correct me also if I put anything in the record wrong. And then, of course, we have Dimitri, who can answer any CEQA questions that have come up. And hopefully you'll be able to take some public comment, deliberate, and thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Jill. Do we have any clarifying questions from the commission? Commissioner DeMond.
Thank you. I just want to say that I was on the Planning Commission when this project was first approved, so just to put that on the record. I don't think that means I have to recuse myself or anything, but so there are several questions that I asked Jill, and these are, I guess, process questions, because I'm always interested in how we can expedite the process, just like John is, and so on. And I'm still not clear on the timeline, not perfectly clear. And I just want kind of to help me out. It's obviously costly for an applicant to kind of start from scratch again and go through the project, although some of these costs were already spent, so it wasn't, I guess, 100%. And so I'm just trying to figure out, as you mentioned, the applicant did sign the approval from the Coastal Commission on June 3rd, 2016. Now, did that not constitute a permit? I mean, so you're saying that the permit expired on July 11th. Tell me why that wasn't a permit, or what was the nexus from what the Coastal Commission required and a permit?
Sure, and I had the same question when this first landed on my desk in February, I think it was this year. The Coastal Commission's permit had a 2-year active timeline, and it was tied to their public hearing, which was held in July 2014. So even though the applicant was not able to get the document until June, the Coastal Commission's approval and all of the conditions of approval that were in the staff report and the record constituted the permit with their expiration of 2 years. And they did cite that it was tied to the hearing date. I find it confusing that you don't get a document until later, so I understand the question, and I asked this, that's how it was explained to me.
Okay, but it says here that the permit was signed on June 3rd, 2016. All right, that's the last bullet on page 3.
Yep.
So tell me.
So what the applicant was doing the applicant was doing a lot of work after the approval in July 2014. The Coastal Commission's permit had preconditions. It meant that the applicant was required to secure a number of items in advance of receiving that document. May let the applicant speak to this, but I know the primary ones were deed restrictions that needed to be recorded for the open space easement for the riparian buffer and the actual riparian zone, as well as the park. And there's other preconditions. I'm going to go. Cameron Jeffs is here with Creekside LLC.
Good evening.
Can he
Why don't we
answer this?
wait on those, okay?
Okay, sorry,
I mean,
Cameron.
'cause
Okay.
I'm sure there are other things
Okay.
that are going to happen. So,
Right.
so I guess we'll find out, why the signing on June 3rd didn't constitute a
That
permit
was
timeline.
That was just when those preconditions had been met and the applicant was available to pick up the document. And applicants sign those documents as proof that they agree to implement the conditions.
Okay, and also, again, I'm also reading on that page 3, last sentence over there says something to the fact that Coastal Commission says that substantially conforms to the project approved by the Coastal Commission, that Coastal Commission staff would support city approval of the project. So it says city, doesn't say planning commission. Why has this come back to the planning commission?
Well, I was using general language. They would consider whatever the city's approval process to be as acceptable, and our process for this application, which is fresh now, comes through the Planning Commission, and then it goes to City Council. So we're treating this just like the original application and any other subdivision that you would see.
So what we're saying is if there's a project like this in the future, it's appealed. The Coastal Commission then puts some new things into that permit that requires the applicant to do something, then that project would come back to the Planning Commission afterwards?
No. This one only came back to you because it expired. Once it was expired, and we're talking about the Coastal Commission's permit, once their permit was expired, they weren't able to extend it, and the applicant no longer had an entitlement and is essentially starting over.
Okay, well, I'll
And that's why they're here.
wait to hear
Yep.
from the applicant
Okay.
on why. Okay, I appreciate that.
All right.
Other questions, I guess, that are clarifying questions, the CCNR issue that you brought up and so on. Typically, if it's a one-off project, a residence that's somehow unique, it'll go through ARC and perhaps come to the Planning Commission. If this subdivision has CCNRs, say like Ocean Colony, will any of the building architecture come back to us or not?
We most likely will bring the architecture back to you. They will need to secure coastal development permits for all the construction. We don't know right now if that's going to come in one package or if it's going to be one by one. It may be that if you see a few single-family homes and you're really comfortable with them, that the director could process the rest of them. You know, we have some flexibility with how to do that going forward.
The issue that I'm kind of trying to raise, I don't want every one of the 10 houses to come to the Planning Commission and say, well, this is too big, this is too small, this is, you know, I mean, I'm kind of thinking ahead on this, so I want to make sure that anything that we can approve here, you know, kind of precludes having to go through this one by one and, you know, saying this should be turned left, right, the backs, so on. So
Sure.
Do CCNRs do that, or what is the
No,
process of doing that?
they don't, but your feedback on processing this is noted and we understand it. The city has residential design guidelines. We expect the applications to conform to those, which is incredibly helpful to us when they do conform. It makes our review process much shorter. And in fact, we may even decide that in some cases that we don't need to bring them to you. We can keep it at the director level.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's all I have for now.
Very good. Commissioner Evans?
So I had a question about revised condition B. There's a new condition in B.6. It's on the memo that we got. And it says the Creekside subdivision shall establish and maintain to provide a sense of openness and views of the Pillarcitas Creek riparian area as well as the western hills beyond. So does that mean this opens the door for someone to say, okay, you're building a house that's going to block a view of the, how's that work? Help me with my naive confusion about this part here.
Sure, and so the intent of the condition is about fencing that would screen views, which is why we showed this slide. We understand the houses are, they're going to become part of the landscape, but we did not want to see fences around the open space area or to have the drainage swale surrounded by high fencing. All of that would be highly visible from both the Shoreline Station parking lot where you have your public farmers market, as well as Highway 1, which is protected a bit in your ordinance. So we could tweak the language of this to be very clear that it's about those kinds of improvements. It's not, we don't expect to be able to have houses that would be designed such that we could see the view as, yes, exactly. Okay.
So I hear you saying that the language should probably be revised to just say.
I think we could improve it, yeah.
Talking about fencing and.
Yep.
Okay. And then a question I had is that, is any of this mapping, if the, either the CCNRs or the owners of the houses or something, or the city, if they want to somehow make trails or pathways or whatever to adjacent properties, there's nothing about this subdivision that would prevent that, is that right?
I need to understand.
Well, like, so for example, on the Hammerhead there, if for some reason or other there was an agreement between property owners, say, well, we want to put a way for people to walk through here to get to here or there. Yeah, there's nothing in this that would prevent those kind of agreements from happening, is there?
Neighbor to neighbor. Yeah, no, I have a gate like that with my neighbor. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, the coastal tram, and it
Yeah.
goes through and it comes from the, and I'm not saying that's something we should ask them to do. It's just,
Right.
would
So-
this preclude any of those kind of?
So let's talk about that for just a minute. No development is allowed within the buffer or the riparian corridor, except for uses that were specified in the city's local coastal program, and in fact were also identified by the Coastal Commission in their approval. And those kinds of uses in those areas are education and research, and a pedestrian kind of a footpath, so not like a big bike trail or something like that. That said, this is why I brought up the Pillarcitas Creek Trail, because we are intending to really utilize the north side of this creek for that trail, and we did not plan to have a trail on the south side here. So neighbors could do what you're talking about, but we weren't prepared to have a public improvement going through that area.
Thank you.
Okay.
Very good, thank you. I appreciate the presentation. I appreciate the, you answered a number of my questions, particularly related to the creek trail, Pillarcitas Creek Trail. I have some questions about the easement area and just long-term management and maintenance of that area. Is this area, it's stated it's encumbered in a conservation easement. Is that a conservation easement that's supported by an endowment or something that provides some level of long-term management and maintenance of that area, or is that more HOA responsibility? Is there thought about just sort of how that area would be maintained in perpetuity?
This has come up on a number of our projects, and we hope that for a project like this, eventually we would have an open space type of trust get involved and help with the management. At this point, the final map processing and the improvement plans and the CCNRs, unless that kind of arrangement is set up, they will need to establish the homeowners association with funding to take care of that function.
But that wouldn't necessarily preclude, say, in the future, if there was some sort of open space agency or somebody who wanted to manage that, if the funding would be established through the HOA sort of requirement,
Right,
through the CCNRs.
right. It would not preclude that. Yep.
Okay, very good. And so I think Commissioner Evans was sort of nipping at some of my question, but there's nothing here. Well, I see the easement on the east side parallel trail, so sort of access from Shoreline Station into the public or into the park area, into the passive park area. That would be secured through that easement in that area. Is there anything we haven't seen anything in relation to what improvements are proposed for that passive park area?
So you've got conditions of approval that require landscape plans to be submitted with the improvement plans for the private street, the passive park, and the drainage swale. So that will come.
Forthcoming.
Yep.
Okay, very good. That answers my major questions. So with that, did the applicant want to present or respond to any questions?
Good evening, Commissioners. Cameron Jeffs. I actually live at 311 Church Street, across from the property. So, anyway, so I don't really have much to present. I could go on and on, but because I've been working on this for almost a decade now. So, but do you have any questions for me or clarifications about the project?
There was the question that came up earlier. Do you want to restate that, Commissioner DeVan?
Yeah, again, just reading through, I was confused. It seemed like you signed this permit within 2 years of when the date was required, but some vague that you hadn't fulfilled everything, so it wasn't a permit. Tell me how that transpired.
Yep. So in June of 2016, June 3rd, we were issued the coastal development permit from the Coast Commission after providing them with and completing all the 11 conditions that we had to comply to on the original CDP they approved in 2014. That included an updated final map, construction plans. I mean, it's in your packet for reference. So how it transpired is once I received the package from the Coast Commission, I delivered it to the city with a final map application and a payment. And in the process of, I think we were at the point of May, we were going to do a final map. We received a phone call in April from Nancy Cave, the district manager for the Coast Commission, staff district manager, and she stated to us that the final map or the CDP had expired, and that was the April 10th, 12th of this year. And I had requested, well, first of all, I stated I didn't believe that was the case because I was told otherwise over the phone by my program analyst, Stephanie Rexing, and I proceeded to provide emails of that, of a request to clarify in the standard condition of the CDP that was issued in 2016, that I believed that there was a discrepancy in the expiration terminology. And I was called by Stephanie Rexing and stating that there was no issue, but nothing in writing. So essentially, I thought that the extension wasn't necessary, and we proceed along with the city, and I think John Dowdy would answer that, and he was helping me as well, along with Bruce Ambo and Mo Sharma. So having determined that we had an expired permit and really we didn't feel like we could probably proceed in a quick direction if we went one route, we decided to go the less painful route as to proceed with just resubmitting the city based on conversations with attorneys, consultants, many other people. So that's why we are where we are.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I
that's-
understand that, okay. Again, it just seemed strange
I
reading
agree.
through this, so.
I agree completely.
I appreciate that. Second question I have is that, I'm not sure whether you got a copy of the October 10th memo that says revised mitigation
Yes,
measures.
I just received it.
Are there any ones that you disagree with? Are there any ones at issue? I mean, for example, the one that Commissioner Evans brought up as far as the sense of openness and views and so on. I mean, that seems vague to me, but you know, if you think that you can live with that, you know, it's obviously up to the applicant yourself on this. So, but I'm just asking that question because if there are any issues, then I think we have to discuss those issues amongst ourselves. So
Yeah.
that's.
In all honesty, I just received this evening. Some of the items I already knew about because I met with the planning manager yesterday for about an hour, and we received the email from Lenny Roberts of the Alliance for Green Foothills. So we addressed those first three items, I believe, which had relationship to the exclusion fencing, and then a couple other items. But and the CCNRs, and then there was one other one. But yeah, it's, you know, and the CCNRs, we didn't have CCNRs in the approval. So it's my opinion that, I mean, based on that item, you know, it seemed to me referencing the hills, Western Hills and beyond. I mean, it's going to be hard. I agree with Commissioner Evans that would be difficult in some respects, especially when it comes to the multifamily area where there's going to be houses, could be potentially two-story, blocking those views. I mean, you may be able to see them through the side yards. I don't know. But I agree in that sense that I'd like that revised or edited in a fashion that really gives a little bit more clarity and more specificity to just the open space area in the western area of the property or project. I'm not too excited about the gating or fencing. I was going to do more of my vision of the project was actually to have a gate not functioning, but a gate at the opening of the project property or the entrance of the property to show it's in a fashion that it's private and it's of that nature. So, because it's a private road. So, but I mean, I can live with it, but I kind of wanted that option if I wanted it. That's about it.
Thank you.
Any other questions, Commissioner Evans? I have a question. I should have directed this to staff earlier, but just regarding the lot retirements.
Yeah.
Do we have, I mean, it sounds like those have been identified, and is there an equivalency in terms of acreage or building footprint or that sort of thing? Sort of how do they relate together, this site versus what's being retired?
Do you want to address that?
I think we both can answer this question. I'll answer it from the regulation perspective, and you can talk about the properties you found, maybe. My understanding of the Coastal Commission's requirements for lot retirements on the mid-coast is that they are seeking individual legal lots that could potentially have development, and they do not specify how big they are. They have to be in the mid-coast area, which can include within Half Moon Bay city limits as well as the mid-coast north of us. And we just have to establish that these are legal lots that have been subdivided. So what we the other little note I wanted to make is, in the condition we have here, there's an option for the applicant to convey the retired lots to a land trust in lieu of having to go through all of the certificate of compliance work with the city, and we would work then with the land trust to deal with it. So we're just trying to make it more flexible for the applicant, but that's how the Coastal Commission enacts it. And I think you have more.
Yeah, actually, from the processing with the Coastal Commission condition compliance process, and the last 2 years from 2014, from the approval to, or notice of intent to improve, to the CDP, I supplied the lots to the Coastal Commission. They accepted them, and they agreed that they were viable lots that would be equivalent. Also, I did I have an open discussion with Joe Chamberlain from the Coastal Land Trust, and she agreed, having seen the lots in our meeting. I think it was 3 weeks ago. I don't remember the date, but she agreed that they would be similar or equivalent lots, that she would, and they would meet the condition.
Okay, very good. Okay, that's all of my questions at this point. Seeing no others, we can move into public comments, and if there's any comments from the public. I don't have any comment cards. Are there any members of the public who wish to speak on this item? Seeing none, we will close the public hearing and bring it back to commission discussion. And I will open it up.
One of the broad issues I brought up is that, if we approve this, I don't want to have to come back over and over again, piecemeal. If somebody says they don't like, or they like that, or they, whether it's for each house. I mean, to me, if we put in condition B, as John indicated, as is, to me that kind of opens up the opportunity for, at any time, for any new residents or something, that it does meet that standard, and we could go round and round. So it seems to me that we kind of need to either change the wording of that, or else take it out. I mean, I'm thinking about our process going forward on this. If the Coastal Commission didn't put this in, why are we adding it, I guess, is my question.
Well, I would suggest that you consider deleting the first sentence and the clause to support this intent, and you could consider the condition starting with the private street. I don't believe, I haven't talked to the Coastal Commission about this potential condition. I would be surprised if they objected to it, because this is a condition that supports some of the findings that they made in their approval with regards to the openness of the western side of the project site, and that was really what I was trying to focus on, as you can see in this graphic. And it, everything about the Coastal Act with respect to coastal access, and they literally use the word maximize coastal access. So I think they'd be very comfortable with this. But I do agree that it should be amended, and that would be my suggested language.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the fire tower issue that we went through, for example, and so I just don't want those kind of issues to come up. If there's any way that we can kind of put the principle down, but not have somebody, every time there's a new house constructed, say this doesn't meet this criteria. I think if we can put some wording to that effect, I would like that. I'm not sure are there any suggestions on your part?
On the fly.
I guess let me read that. It says, "The private street serving the new community shall not be gated or fenced." Let me kind of bring that up too. I thought the Coastal Commission, others don't want people walking in the riparian zone. Isn't one kind of counter
Well, there is
to the other? I mean, that's
separate
so,
fencing.
why does one, why do we need that? I mean, I'm trying to figure out what that can,
So if I
What
can, I
otherwise?
think what Jill is trying to do, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the intent is to sort of avoid a wall of fence as you're driving down Highway 1, as you're looking towards the west. So the question isn't necessarily fencing along the riparian area or fencing of different areas. It's the, some brick sound wall or wood fence that basically blocks off the housing from Highway 1. So maybe there's, a transparent fence or, some other sort of measure that we can include in there. So
well, I mean, for example, there's one street from Church Street that'll be headed west. Why not have a gate with a card for the 10 houses that are going to be there? I mean, is there any reason for there not to be that, and does this sentence preclude something like that? Just for example, I'm just throwing something like that out.
I can, just for the sake of debate, would not support any gated community there, or something that would establish sort of some level of privileged access or something like that. I think that's sort of antithesis to Half Moon Bay and the sort of the openness of our community, and just generally, would want to avoid any condition that would permit that type of a exclusive sort of development.
If I may add to that a little bit, for the use permit for residential development on its own, one of the thoughts about that was its relationship to the single-family development on the other side of Church Street. Staff was concerned about having the connection work. This is a neighborhood. You're trying to you're building a neighborhood here. This is really going to make a neighborhood at the end of Church Street. And I think if it's gated, that's really hard to have that experience. So that's why I showed that. Now, on the western side, it's really that in support of the Coastal Commission's direction. So, and as Vice Chair Holt described, the kind of the walls, what fences could do in that area was a concern.
Okay, so if the new wording, and this is for my fellow commissioners, says the private, what's been struck out is the first sentence. It's on B6, the Creekside subdivision shall be established, maintained, provide a sense of openness, et cetera, to support this intent. Those two sentences have been struck. So just the next sentence, starting with the private street, is what's left in there. So I'm okay with that. I'm not sure if anybody else is, but let me pass it back so you can read it.
I think, and staff may agree, but there might be some nuance that can be built in there in terms of the sentence, in terms of, it says right now, the private street serving the new community shall not be gated nor fenced. I don't think the intent is to say that there's no fences around the property at all. So there might be some nuance that can be built in there to sort of indicate that isn't inconsistent with the other condition that requires fencing, and something that wouldn't necessarily cause problems in the future. That's all you got? Very good. Commissioner Evans? Comments? You said your piece?
No. No more questions, no more comments for me.
Very good. Okay, well, I think, you know, I think wanting to understand just the, in general, I'm always concerned with projects that come in and have some level of either a dedication or a protection of open space areas that doesn't have some corresponding funding for the long-term maintenance of that, and sort of understanding just how that area will be maintained in the long term. I think recognizing that there's a requirement for fencing outside of that riparian buffer for this area, so really those property owners have no real interest in the remainder of their lots that are going to be extending into those areas because of the fencing, and so just ensuring, you know, 20 years down the road, these don't become the obligation of the city of Half Moon Bay to continue to maintain those in perpetuity. So, so understanding that funding of those areas, I think, is important for me. And again, I would not like to see any sort of gated type of structure or anything like that. I agree with staff in that this is this neighborhood should be part of the community and should be well integrated into that community, and I don't think establishing a gated community serves that. But beyond that, I appreciate the applicant's efforts in sort of going through this, and certainly I deal with these types of projects all the time, and so I can appreciate frustration in terms of permitting and everything else. So so thanks for staying with it. And as it moves forward, you know, if there is opportunities to see some level of detail or getting a better sense of just what happens with that passive park area, and really how that comes together, I think would be an important discussion. But beyond that, I'm willing to entertain a motion. So.
By resolution, recommend to the City Council approval of PDP-17-031 for the Creekside project, which includes an application for a tentative subdivision map, coastal development permit, and use permit to subdivide 2 parcels totaling approximately 5.5 acres into 12 residential lots, an open space conservation area, a passive recreation park, a private street, and associated infrastructure pursuant based upon the findings and evidence contained in Exhibit B and subject to the conditions of approval and Exhibit 8 of the draft resolution, including the add-ons that we got in the, are they part of this? Including the revisions of the staff report dated October 10th, subject to the changes made in number 8.
6, correct?
New condition B6, pardon me, B6.
Is that clear?
Second?
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, motion passes. With that, we are at adjournment. We'd just like to adjourn this meeting in honor of those who lost their lives in the North Bay and all those who are struggling with wildfires in Napa, Sonoma, Mendocino County. So hopefully we can keep all of them in our minds. So with that, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.